Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 72nd episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Um, so we last episode we did not talk about Michael Malice's Anarchist Handbook. So as we've been doing, we talk about Michael Malice's Handbook and then talk about something else, and then go back to the handbook. So today we are going to go over chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9 is the introduction from Johann Most's book, The Science of Revolutionary Warfare, which is basically a book on. It's like the anarchist cookbook, but from 100 years ago or so. And then Louis Lingg's a speech he gave. Louis Lingg was an anarchist, and he was one of the people. Were the seven? I think there were 7 anarchists that were accused of throwing a bomb in Chicago's Haymarket Square. And
it was actually 8 for the record, and this we try to be very
8.
precise on this.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
8, not 7.
Okay.
Correction.
I'm disappointed in myself. But anyway, so he was one of the 8 anarchists that was accused of this, and actually, from what I understand, none of the 8 that were accused, there was no proof that any of them were, connected with that bombing. But they were, accused and put to death, and not all of them were put to death. Sorry, some of them were. Louis Lingg was one of them, though. But he gave a speech, condemning the court ruling, basically saying, "You're not condemning me for the bomb throwing, or you're not condemning me for making bombs. You're condemning me for being an anarchist." So we're going to use that as a springboard to free associate on kind of the opposite of reformism. Like, what do we think about the people that give up on wanting to reform the system or work within the system at all, and just want to do a direct action which will destabilize and undermine the dominant social order? So I think this kind of reminds me of the episode we did on, and I said this to Matt off air, the episode we did on Israel and Palestine, because we were very creative, because I wanted to talk about Israel and Palestine that week, and Matt wanted to talk about political violence. And so what did we do? We just combined the two. We used the Israel-Palestine as, we talked about that for a little bit, but then we got into a broader conversation about, what is, or when is political violence ever justified, if it is. And I think I said, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I know it must have been something to the effect of, I'm not opposed to it in principle, but a lot of times in practice, it probably will only end up hurting you in the long run, because you'll be executed, you'll be put in jail for the rest of your life. There's no real will to do that. A lot of people, this might be the issue with revolutionaries, right? Getting people to want to die for the revolution. But at the same time, it's like, there are situations, I think, if you were in Nazi Germany, right? I know Jordan Peterson saying we all would have been Nazis, but it's like, I guess if we had the moral compass we have now and we were put in Nazi Germany, we like to think that we would have rebelled against the government, perhaps even, an open arms rebellion against the government, because the government was so atrocious and immoral that, something had to be done about it. You can't just stay on the sidelines and do nothing, because you're afraid of what harm could come to you. You actually have to take a stand against evil. And that's, of course, also this is a side point, but that's also like the sort of neocon argument you hear, right? It's like, well, we have to take a stand against, these terrorist groups, or we have to invade this country or have a base in this country, because we can't just sit, by and let evil doers, commit genocide or harm or governments gas their people or whatever. We actually have to make the world a better place for everybody. So that's just a very like, I guess like the broadest possible way you could think about the issue. Before I actually give more of my thoughts, I would like to hear Matt's.
Yeah, I jotted down a few things that like this topic broadly brings up. So like the first section is literally him saying, you shouldn't make dynamite. It's not cost effective. You should buy dynamite. And it's like, wow, that has a lot of implications. And the second segment is all about, you know, the court of law is unfair. It doesn't care. You couldn't prove this. You're going to kill me anyways. I'm an anarchist. And he kind of is spin in the face of the people who want to try him. Um, the related topics you're kind of getting at when you bring up the Israel Palestine one is we talked a lot about like what is justified political opposition and political violence, but then you can't really talk about that without acknowledging how ineffective political violence can be for your cause. And I mean, on the last episode, we just talked a lot about how incrementalism is kind of the only way sometimes. And political violence or large acts of political resistance hurt causes a lot. I remember when I was a little more sympathetic to traditional right wingers, um, they were talking about the Black Lives Matter, how they would block off parts of freeways, right? So they would essentially close down freeways to champion their cause. Turns out people really don't like when you close down their freeways because they want to get home because they just worked for 9 hours at the job they don't like. And when you're the one that's making them take longer to get home and like miss dinner with their family, people are pretty pissed about it and they hate you for it. Especially if you know you're indifferent about their cause or aren't already in favor of them. And even people who are in favor of it are like, "Cool, I agree with you. Can you not block my way home? My life's hard." So political violence kind of overlaps there in the sense of are you making friends and are you just dying for your cause? This is the other topic I kind of want to bring up is the idea of how important is martyrdom? Is martyrdom good or not? Right? So you can talk about how maybe people overly are sympathetic to the ideas of being martyrs, like they think sacrificing themselves is a good thing. This is something Ayn Rand would probably point to as a flaw, I guess, in our culture. Um, is it's the Christ story, right? Look, I am the person who is virtuous. Kill me for my cause and let my name live on forever because my cause will win eventually. Um, I don't really think that's how being a martyr works. And I don't think that's how it plays out in practice most of the time. And I don't think a lot of political violence is effective for that reason. A lot of people who have a really wild cause and then kill people because of it are often thought of as like some of the worst people. And it doesn't make people more sympathetic to what they're saying. It's kind of like how me and Matt have a running joke that we want to read Ted Kaczynski's works for maybe the 100th episode. That's an idea that we've kicked around. And I am a little worried that because I've slowly heard more and more about Ted Kaczynski, that he actually has a lot of really good points but it sucks because then I have to qualify everything I say with I'm agreeing with the guy who killed a bunch of people that he probably wasn't that justified in killing, but he did have a couple good points. So it's like, is that really good that now you've painted this association? Like, probably not. So when it comes down to it, is it even an effective political task? And is it overly glorified being a martyr? And I would say it's probably glorified and it shouldn't. But that's the only thing I really want to add on to what you were saying, at least to start with.
Um, so I have to put on my like academic scholar hat for a second, and sort of take you back to like 18th century or 19th century French, German, and English Romanticism, because this idea of like dying for your cause, I think really springs up from that movement because it's about one aspect of that like kind of cultural or intellectual movement was sort of a admiration of sincerity. um, the idea was like, well, the ancient regime or the old neoclassical art or whatever was like rigid and not sincere, and it was like just meant to look good, but it was like separated from real life, and it was ideal, or it was like, I guess, idealized in like a mathematical sense that the Romantics didn't like, and so it's like because if you'd gone to a church father, say in the Middle Ages, and you talked to them about like how sincere some Muslim warrior is, like you say, and like if you'd be like, well, I'm not a Muslim, so I don't agree with him, of course, but like this guy's so sincere, you have to admire that. Like, and this is a point that Isaiah Berlin, the political theorist, made in his lectures on Romanticism. He's like, the church father would not understand what you were talking about, because that they would view that Muslim as evil, or like because they have an evil ideology and they're following evil, and so the sincerity has nothing at all to do with it. In fact, that's a bad thing. But then the Romantics come along and say, well, no, like if you're sincere, if you want to die for your cause, that's a great thing, because it is sort of I guess almost liberating you from your person, and you become a symbol, or you become a no, I guess symbol is the right phrase there. You become something other than yourself, is the idea. You transcend somehow. Now, I'm not really sympathetic to that. I mean, I think there is something. I think there is something to be said for really fighting for something you care about. And like, I mean, I don't want to be the guy that's like defending political violence, but I also don't actually. I don't want to make the opposite, mistake and say it's never ever justified, or I would never in any circumstances ever maybe take up arms against a threat or an enemy. But it's like I'm not. I mean, and this like the situation in the U.S. is like a pretty good example, because uh, 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 I'm not willing to overthrow the federal government right now. I'm just not willing to throw myself into that sort of life. I'm not willing to go to jail or be put to death, or like I'm not willing to sacrifice myself for that in this situation. Because we could make the argument that, well, the situation's terrible, Matt, and the U.S. government is evil, and you have to do something about it. But at the end of the day, I'm myself am more concerned with, I guess, improving things in ways that are not political violence. Again, part of it is just for the sort of the selfish reason of like, I don't want to die for that. But also for what you talked about, how like the optics aren't often good. And it's often very like counterproductive in the long run, or like it's just because this is like, and I apologize if I said this again, or if I said this in a previous episode, but like many people would argue that like the difference between Malcolm X and Dr. King was Malcolm X like radicalized people, or like kind of like if you look at if you took the moderate like white voter who was kind of like on the fence about segregation or on the fence about civil rights, they weren't like extremely rabidly racist, but they were like not sure about like certain aspects of that movement, right? And you put them in front of Malcolm X, they're just gonna like recoil in horror and be like, he's advocating black separatism. He's saying the white man's the devil. How can I support any of that? But then Dr. King came along, and influenced by like Gandhi and the sort of I guess peaceful resistance, and you could say that the Dr. King's greatest strength was because he was more moderate, because he was more less willing to think in terms of violence. He persuaded people more, and he did more for the movement in the long run.
Yeah, I think I'm sympathetic to a lot of what you laid out there. And I want to build on it a little bit. So it sounds easy when we lay it out in like a rational way about maybe why being a martyr isn't a particularly good thing. I'm individually oriented, and I kind of bound my existence based on when I live and die. So for me to die for a cause, I don't think that's more authentic or less authentic really because I'm still dead, right? So even if I do die for my cause and that somehow solidifies something, it's like, well, I didn't get to live to see that manifested. And I think that's a pretty big loss. Now, I think the idea of martyrdom ties in with very, very high ideological purity. And I also I've been kind of joking at how this kind of plays into, especially with like libertarian and cappy, very strong anti-government, pro-gun people. Like there's almost an element of like cosplaying in terms of their rhetoric. So it's like if they hear the government wants to mandate vaccinations, you see them like respond with "Come get me," and then like they picture their gun, right? And to some extent, I'm like if somebody wanted to inject you with something and you shot them, I'm not going to be a person who's that upset about it. Frankly, I'm willing to stake that out. But the way I would kind of put it is like you're saying come get me for either one of two reasons. Or there's a few, but like the most likely reasons are like you're trying to show, hey, I don't want the government to walk on me anymore. And I don't think they have the actual willpower to come to my door with guns and really force me. But like if they had a police force, right, 10 people with guns, and you're saying, I have a gun, come get me, I'm not taking that, like you're essentially saying, I'm willing to die over this. And I think that's pretty silly. If they actually believe that, I think they're insane. And if they're like co-opting the aesthetics to portray themselves as tough, I think they're like a loser cosplaying and they're doing it for political purity points, right? It's just rhetoric, it's just aesthetics. So, but a lot of that is because innately the idea of I'm willing to die for this cause and stand on this hill is like a macho thing that makes you sound like you're not a loser. So even though you actually in the real world, unfortunately, if the cops show up with guns, there's 12 of them, you're there with one gun, like they're either going to kill you or you're going to take the vaccine in that hypothetical, right? And you could say, I don't want to live on this world. I'm going to die. It's like, cool. You said the tough words, but you're dead now. Or you're the coward that takes it. So it's like they almost set up this false dichotomy where the only acceptable not being a wuss choice is to die over something. But maybe some people just don't want to die because they view life as like a finite thing. And I don't think that should be associated with cowardice. So this is something that I see in certain ideologically pure ANCAP circles that I just think is kind of silly. But I think a lot of people are going to be like that once you start getting into highly ideological spaces. And people are agitated, right? Like I'm sick and tired of things like certain regulations screwing up my life. So if people want to use really harsh rhetoric to describe how I feel, it might not actually be true. I'm just saying it to show how pissed I am. The other thing I want to throw into this before I pass the ball back to you is the idea of, and this plays into what you were saying with Malcolm X, but there was this movie that came out earlier this year. I thought it sucked. I wouldn't recommend it just because I thought it was a bad movie, but it was about the Black Panthers. It was called Judas and the Black Messiah. And it's all about God. Oh, this is terrible that I bring up a movie that's based on historical truths and I don't know any of the people's names. That's only an error I would make. But the main character isn't actually the good guy leader who's like ideologically pure. It's the guy who gets in trouble with the law and the law tells him to infiltrate the group. And it's this example of the government has a guy in there and they tried to get him to get the group to do things that are even more violent than what they're currently doing, right? It's this idea that he shows up with dynamite in his trunk and he's trying to convince the good guy leader of that sect of people to bomb City Hall with them because if we bomb City Hall, we'll really show them. But in reality, the government wanted them to bomb City Hall, right? Or to blow up City Hall because then the public opinion will be these people are terrorists, right? And that's kind of my thoughts on people who say, come get me if you're going to force a vaccine. Because I'm like, well, what's going to happen is there's going to be one guy who agrees with me on principle. And that one guy is going to shoot two stupid 18-year-old nurses that took an unpaid opportunity to try to spread the cause they care about, which is vaccines. And this guy's going to overreact and shoot them both. And then all of a sudden, everybody with my views is a domestic terrorist. And it's like, why? Because one guy took come get me too seriously or too literally when it wasn't a true estimation of the circumstances. So all this is to say, political violence is generally an effective choice, and it's subconsciously glorified too.
I guess I do want to push back a little bit, but and the way I want to, I'm so sorry, something caught in my throat. The way I want to push back is, I think the issue nowadays, though, it's not really like I hear what you're saying about the glorification of martyrdom, or the glorification of, like, I'm going to take a stand against these evil dictators or whatever, or these evil tyrants or the evil government or whatever. And I could see why that would be frequent in, say, libertarian circles. Like, I sent you a meme a while back, where what was it? It was like Yoda saying, dive, in a shootout with the IRS, I will, or something like that. And that's like a meme, but it's like the meme is a symptom of a broader idea of, like, it's a, moral of you, or it's like a great thing for you to do to, stand up against the IRS, because taxation is theft. And, if you're going to go, be killed by the government. But if you take out a few people who are trying to force you to pay taxes, well, you're fighting the man. And then I guess another thing I wanted to mention that you brought up about cosplaying. It's so funny, like, and this is like this example has now become a cliche, but like the people who have like Che Guevara t-shirts, or the people that have Che Guevara posters, and it's like, they feel like these true, like, revolutionaries, because they have, this poster they can point to, when it's like none of them actually did anything that Che Guevara, who was an actual revolutionary, did. And whether or not you disagree with, or whether or not you like martyrdom, is sort of a separate question from, Che Guevara did actually lead a revolutionary life.
And I want to jump in real quick, but this applies to Antifa Proud Boys. Like, what is Antifa Proud Boys if not people cosplaying a revolution, when it's just a bunch of basement dwellers who are right wingers and left wingers fighting it in front of random city halls? Like, what is that if not LARPing?
But I think so there's another subtle message that can be kind of like smuggled into these kinds of conversations, and the smuggled message is someone like what was that famous writer Jordan Peterson always talks about, Solzhenitsyn. He wrote the Gulag Archipelago, and basically, like, what I hear from a lot of people nowadays, and I think part of it actually does go back to the rabid individualism I see, but it's this idea, that, like, you can't fix the world, and the world's evil, the world's bad. You have extreme form of pessimism, like you can't do anything to change the world because you're so broken and evil and wrong yourself. That was kind of like, that's why Jordan Peterson likes Solzhenitsyn so much, right? Because he's saying the horrible thing about, like, Bolshevism, was that it released the inner evil in man, and every man is, like, innerly truly a monster, and therefore we can't release the inner evil. We have to stay within these conservative institutions. We have to go back to the Russian Orthodox Church. We have to go back to, well, not the Russian Empire, but like some other form of, like, Russian autocracy, or Russian oligarchy, because if we don't accept these restraints, then it's like, then mankind is just going to be bathed in blood, and it's just going to be all horrible and evil. But like that sort of messaging, it actually inhibits real social change. It actually says to people, don't change the world. You can't change the world. Because what is Jordan Peterson always saying? You can't change the world because you have to clean your room. It's like, that is, like, I think fundamentally a very bad worldview to have, because it's not acknowledging that the world as it is right now, or like socio-political structures as we have now, they don't have to be that way. Like, they're that way for a certain reason, and they can be different, and they could be different if people actually did things that made them different. If they actually did affect the institutions, or if they actually did reform or reform the institutions, or get rid of the institutions and create new ones. So, if we're going to talk about political violence, I don't want people to forget that they can change the world and they should change the world. You just have to be very pragmatic, in how you're going to change the world. And I'm glad you brought up the point about the government infiltrating the Black Panthers, right? Because I think a lot of the issues, so people think of the 60s, or in conversations nowadays people have about the 60s, if you're like a Ben Shapiro type, you're like, oh, these crazy 60s hippies or the Black Panthers, all these were crazy people that went too far and they were undermining Western civilization. And the issues today is that they succeeded. And we have to get back to like the time before, well, not exactly, but we have to like recapture the good of the past and, and undo the evil of the 60s, so to speak. But the thing is, I think part of the evil of the 60s was the government, turning a lot of these movements into more violent, destructive movements than they originally were, because they were trying to prevent real change. And so they were trying to create sort of chaos within these various movements, or trying to undermine undermine the ability for these activists or these groups to actually do anything. So don't forget that the world can be a better place, and you can be a part of that.
Yeah. I had 2 points, but I think one of them is slightly unrelated, and I forgot it a little bit. So I'm going to talk about institutional nihilism. I think I'm going to take a moderate stance, and I think I think it hints. Well, okay. So one way that you and I argue, and I think talk past each other a lot, is often things can sound right, but I think they are in conflict with other similar actions people could take, or you have to acknowledge there's an opportunity cost. So, like my institutional, I have to some degree, I have some institutional nihilism in the sense I don't think I can really change a lot of things, right? Um, Now you're saying there is capacity to change it. These institutions are made of people, so technically, those people could be people you like more and do the things you like more. That's not off the table, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't acknowledge the degrees in which that would take to enact compared to, say, focusing on things that are more easily under your control, right? So if I think of it, and this is why I give more credit to Jordan Peterson than you, but a lot of the institutional problems I think are like deeply systemic and are very hard to overturned, because I think there are just logical headwinds that cut against people going against status quo. And I think these are like thinking errors in the human brain, right? So seeing what is seen, but not seeing what is unseen, having a hard time grasping counterfactuals. Like, I think these are things that constantly cut against some of the claims I make because they're just harder to comprehend, or they're not the average layman's intuitions because they go maybe a different direction than people naturally want to do, even if it's, I think, more valid of a point. Um, but it's really easy for me to do things in my own life, at least relative to the grand scale, to make them better. So a lot of what Jordan Peterson is saying goes back to what you can do as a person. And I wouldn't agree with him that everything is broken beyond belief, but I do think a lot of things are closer to being unfixable. And as we're talking, I mean, I think the 60s is much more corrupt and co opted by government than you do, even because I think Charles Manson was essentially to some degree an inside job. I would recommend Chaos by Tom O'Neill. Great book, but there's no reason why Charles Manson shouldn't have been in prison like 6 times over when he went and committed his crimes, and he was let out really for no reason, and nobody could justify any of the times he was set free when everybody knew he was this really, really sketchy character. And this lines up with the timing of all the stuff with like CIA's MK Ultra and them testing weird things on weird people and accidentally killing some people. So it's like you have these peace movements in the 60s that were immediately co-opted by the government to make anti-war stuff look bad. So to some degree, it's like the stuff that basic people do to try to push ideas on a big scale, like going for protests, gets framed by the people who are in power, and they frame it in a way that is with the intent to hurt those causes. Um, a couple weeks ago, you and I had a conversation about COVID, and we revisited it. And I mentioned that other countries had a lot more protests than what I was seeing in the United States. Part of the reason, though, is because in the United States, when I dug into it, there have been a lot of protests. They're just not covered on any of the national wide outlets. Like it's just not being portrayed. It's much more difficult to find unless a violent incident happens at one, then they amplify it. So it's like there are these headwinds that need to be acknowledged and make institutional change painfully difficult relative to fixing things in your own life. So I'm not trying to advocate Jordan Peterson, but I am saying you only have so much time in the day, only so much effort to expend, and most people don't aren't able to put a lot of effort in a lot of directions. And I would say putting time into yourself is probably better than doing things that historically are co-opted to be defamed or, attacked. I'm not saying you should give up, but like what I do is I talk about people who work for the government like they're the scum of the earth. And I know Matt's not necessarily sympathetic to being disgusted with people like public school teachers, but like when I'm talking with a friend that knows my views and they mention how somebody they know, oh, that person's a school teacher now, I'm like, oh, that's such a disgusting waste. I can't believe that person went that downhill. Like I'll say that and it's like a joke, but I'm also kind of spreading the ethos of you should look down at these people. And everything I say about people who work for the government is in the vein of these people are, the rot on the bottom of my shoe. um, Doing that alone and talking to people with that tone and perpetuating that tone, I think probably does more than if I went to certain organized groups. And I'm okay with that. I just think that means there's better ways to pursue other things, and some things are worth my time more than others. I've accepted that, and I don't think that's necessarily bad.
So this is definitely a disagreement, which I'm going to pursue at least up to a point until we have to agree to disagree, or someone feels like they won something. But so I actually don't think that Charles Manson example is a very good example because when I'm talking about the 60s, which again, big term means very, very different things. It was a very complex time. I know you're not a fan of stories and history because you think you think it has a tendency to overgeneralize and not tell both sides of the story and whatnot. And that's definitely an issue you have to contend with when you're talking about history. But I guess based on my study of the 60s, it really is built that desire. It's really the counterculture idea, or it was really the countercultural revolution that I think is should be inspiring and we should take lessons from. I think it failed. I mean, it failed insofar as it didn't go as far as it wanted to. Eventually, a lot of it did become incorporated into mainstream culture, and other parts of it fell to the dirt. But I stress this point that you should not give up on wanting to make big political, historical, cultural change in your lifetime. I'm not saying like everyone has to sacrifice something major, but I'm saying that if we do want the world to be better, if we do want to fight for what we think is right, then we can't say that the Jordan Peterson line that is, well, I'm just gonna do these minor things and I'm just gonna focus on bettering myself because institutions are gonna corrupt my movement and institutions are far more powerful than me and therefore I'm gonna fail and probably get incarcerated or something. That is really a worldview which I
Hey,
fundamentally
that's not the world.
reject.
That's just that's a mischaracterization. So I have to jump in to say that though, because it's not saying. Well, at least I'm not willing to defend that, but I don't think that's what he's arguing. I think it's just a preference. So one thing is very much in your control, as much as anything in your life can be in control. Like, sure, some people might not have control over their career, but it's generally because those people do not have skills. And if those people don't have control over their careers, usually they also don't have control over any aspect of their life. But if you think about the things you have control over, if you're a powerful person, and even if you're not a powerful person, the thing you ultimately have the most power over anything else is your own life. So all I'm acknowledging, I'm not saying you shouldn't do those other things. I'm saying given that time is scarce, there's one of these things is more important to your life than the other. I'm not saying you should give up, but I do think the 60s example, if anything, it makes me, I'm not going to generalize from it a point, but the things that survive from the 60s culture are things that could be appropriated into popular culture in a way that ends up serving the state. Because I would say things like I'm okay with cultural and I guess the negative word is degeneracy, but I like the word degenerate. I think it's a fun word, so I'm going to use it. A lot of the degenerate culture that stemmed from what we consider like the 60s hippie peace movement, like that stuff, I think cuts in favor of the state. It helps perpetuate the state, and all the stuff that cuts against it, like being anti-war, didn't live on at all because the establishment has maintained being a warmonger, and conventional wisdom isn't really any less anti-war unless you talk about since Trump became a big figure, and that's just because people are so partisan. And Trump said things that were anti-war sometimes, even though his policy didn't even line up with that. So I see the hippie movement as the things that survived in cultural change are the things the state allowed to survive or decadent enough to jive with how the state wanted things anyways. All the things that cut against state power or that I guess amalgamation of policies and things like that, all the stuff that would cut against it died off with that movement. Like I just think that's a black pill of an example. I wouldn't generalize that to all, but I'm just saying, if that's an example to show something positive about being in a movement, like, yeah, I could see the state letting the things it likes live from a movement, but that's all.
Um, okay, I guess let me take a different tack then. I think what Jordan Peterson, I mean, first of all, Jordan Peterson is not. So here's an example, and I'm not trying to use this example to like label him as a bad person, and I'm not trying to like kick a man while he's down. But of course, what we realized for after a while was he was suffering from benzo addiction, right? And he was really struggling. He was in a coma for a while in Russia to try to so he didn't have to experience the withdrawal symptoms. He even acquired COVID, I think. I think his wife had like some actually, I'm going to focus on the benzo addiction for a second because, and I'm not trying to say like, oh, he's imperfect, therefore we should hate him, because like, no, you can be imperfect. That's fine. I'm not saying like that would be that would be a mischaracterization of my argument. But what I am saying is, he didn't follow his own advice of cleaning his room. He wants to change the world himself. But he's preaching that he still is preaching this, you need to clean your room.
I think he's admitted that.
That's fine, but
and he's saying I failed and I should do better. I should clean my own room. I think that's what he's said since he's come back.
That's fine, but I don't think that admission like changes the fact on the ground. I don't think that admission just because he says that admission, and it doesn't mean he's not a hypocrite in that sense. And so maybe we're not disagreeing then. Maybe it's just a difference of emphasis that I'm picking up on. But I'm going to bat for changing the world is a good thing. Finding a movement that you care about and doing a lot of things and doing direct action. Going to protests or like having conversations with people. Heck, even if the person's really good, even like volunteering for a campaign or something, or like, campaigning on certain policies, right? Even running for office potentially. I mean, it's like, I don't want people to give up. And I know you're saying you're not saying that. So I guess we're in agreement then. But
no, we're not.
I do think that
we're not in agreement at all.
That's fine, but let me finish. So I do think that we can have a tendency to just focus on ourselves and not focus on some greater good that we can do that we could do in the political realm, in the social realm, in the cultural realm. And I'm not even saying people have to do it, but what I'm saying is don't, abandon that ideal, or don't abandon that way of life. And in fact, I was doing some research recently for an upcoming project, and there's a direct connection between political activism and happiness. There's a direct connection between, getting out there in your community and actually trying to change something, or trying to fight for your values, and like your overall well-being. So that would be like a more pragmatic, or more quantitative way of defending what I'm saying.
Okay, well, I'm going to ignore your pragmatic point for the same reason I ignore the point when religious people say religious people are happier. I bring up that analogy, and then I use that analogy to say that seems similar to that in a way that I disregard that point. I want clarification on something, because you were right in the sense that we disagree on emphasis, but to bring up an example, I watched a movie with my brother, and I was trying to explain to him how much I liked the movie because a couple of the characters were depraved. And he's like, "Yeah, I knew those characters were bad characters when blah blah happened." And I was like, "No, you don't get it. You're saying they were bad characters. Everybody who watched the movie knew those characters were bad characters, right? Everybody watched the movie; they knew they were supposed to be the bad guys. And I'm saying those guys weren't a 6.5 out of 10, a 6.5 out of 10 on the bad scale. I'm saying those people were a 9.8. And I vigorously felt those people were 9.8. So this is the point I'm trying to get across to you is a lot of, okay, so I feel like the point you're making downplays two crucial things that you're not addressing. And that's why we're both going in our separate loops. And I want to bring our loops together. So I need clarification. You're willing to recognize that we can only do so much in the day. We only have so much energy to put forward. We only have so many things we can commit ourselves to. And you haven't disputed the fact that like we have more power over our own lives than the rest of the world. And we've gone over how there are a lot of movements that don't amount to anything significant. We've gone over that a lot of movements get co-opted. And I can imagine that I could partake in political activism that amounts to something. I could imagine that. But implying that that is the likely outcome of my participation in political activism, and not the unlikely, hopefully would happen. But no, it's more unlikely than not, unless your goals are very simple. Like I want to be an establishment Democrat. If your goals are anything like remotely off the basic level of being an establishment Republican or Democrat, odds are your change is going to be very insignificant given the time you have to put into this change on the macro scale. So I'm not saying don't try. I'm just saying you need to acknowledge that the thing you have the most control over, most directly impacts your life in a significant way, is cleaning your own room. It's obvious. I'm not saying you shouldn't partake in these other things you've talked about. I'm just saying to even imply that there's a good chance it'll be successful if your goals are anywhere outside of the norm is a pretty much a lie. You need to communicate the amount of probability of this thing going forward. And I'm not saying it's impossible, because obviously things have changed. I'm just saying most people, when they engage in politics, have very generic views. A lot of people go and campaign for a very generic candidate. And usually it's not in a close race. But if it is a close race, maybe they might have tipped the scale slightly. Probably the result would have happened either way. Now you can lie and say, hey, it probably won't matter, but you can do it anyway because it'll make you happier and it'll make you feel part of the community, and feeling part of the community is a good thing. But I don't want to give the impression that people can make or are likely to make radical change unless they commit their lives to something. Well, unless you're willing to commit your lives to that view, then you should really just focus on fixing yourself if you want the most bang for your buck. Because everybody's exhausted, everybody's tired, everybody has other real life in their personal life duties that need to be taken care of. Those need to be taken care of first and foremost. That's where you have the most impact. So, yeah, it is a disagreement on the point of emphasis, but I think that's like the most important thing.
So I think I guess what I'm really trying to get across to you and to the audience is uh, every movement that ever did any change. And I recognize that sometimes there are movements that fail, or there are movements that get co-opted by the government or something. But every movement that ever did change the world, there was never a guarantee that they would change the world, and there was never a guarantee that, that anything would happen. And, um, I mean, but I can acknowledge the trade-offs. That's fine. But I think you're, and I mean, if feel free to correct me if you feel like my interpretation is wrong, but I feel like you're being too pessimistic in sort of your analysis of, well, I'm not going to ever actually change the world because I'm just one, person. I mean, it's very unlikely that I'm ever going to change the world just because I'm one person. And this is sort of like where I think the individualism versus collectivism debate, which frustrates me to no end.
Well, it's not a philosophical disagreement we're having. We're having a quantitative disagreement on the level of likelihood of impact you have.
Well, no, I guess I take your point, but I mean, it's a community getting together to do something, like a bunch of people, signing on to something, a bunch of people willing to fight for something. That can actually. This is the reason I brought up the individualism versus collectivism debate, because a group can really, cause significant change. So can an individual, but if you don't have a group, I think has much more power than an individual does. But people nowadays aren't willing to do that communal struggle for the reasons that you're talking about, and I'm trying to fight against those very reasons.
Well, it depends how narrow the goals are. Like, sure, school boards are getting toppled right now in all sorts of places because they have mask mandates, and then people show up and overthrow their school board. That happens. Also, it's like, but in a sense, that's very narrow. And in a sense, when it's so micro, as in your school board, it's like, sure, that's a communal thing, but to some degree, who's teaching your kids if you choose to have your kids sent to a school, just cleaning your room a little bit. So, but I guess what I'm getting at is I think it's a quantitative question. It's where's your time better spent? Like, I do this podcast because my hobby. I don't do this podcast because I think I'm going to get a lot of change in the direction I'm working for. That doesn't mean I'm not going to do the podcast. It's fun to talk about these issues. And it's fun to argue and have a good argument with people about all sorts of things. Yeah, but I just feel like your emphasis in you can get people together and do something means your idea has to be broad enough to get a lot of people on board with you. A lot of times the issue when you want to change something is the majority of people are against me and I'm pissed, right? That's what's happening right now in a lot of places. A lot of times the people who are the most upset are people who are the intense minority in their region. So there's a lot of places that are 80% Democrat and the 20% of Republicans there are upset. They really can't do a lot. And telling them they could do a lot besides move is like kind of misleading. That's what I'm getting at. And I wouldn't want to mislead those people into dedicating a lot of their time to something when they maybe should just try to get a better job and make their life better in ways that are more realistic and attainable. I feel like that's better advice or better guidance.
I mean, I don't think I'm misleading anybody, because I think a lot of these movements that did succeed or did like change the world, I keep using that phrase, they did start as minorities. I mean, most people, they didn't originally like the civil rights movement or support the civil rights movement. Now everyone they teach you in schools about how great the civil rights movement was, but that took a lot of effort to convince the majority of people. Originally, it was.
I think you're making a thinking error.
So I think a lot of minorities, did end up changing the majority's opinion.
Terminal velocity. That's that idea. Like I think that was I mean, if you meant it in the way I heard it, I think that was just a misunderstanding, maybe. Like, if the civil rights movement happened earlier in time, it wouldn't have been allowed to exist. It needed a certain level of minority support in a community to be able to achieve what it was able to achieve. If it was a small enough minority, it gets squashed. So like it's like, yeah, they all start as not the majority, but it's like if you're too much of a minority, then you get squashed. It wasn't like their ideas were new. It was enough people were sympathetic to their ideas, even though they were still a minority. So it's like it's misleading to attribute all the success to that group when like it didn't all happen at once, right? And the other thing I want to throw out there, and this is a little condescending, but it's like you have to buy a ticket to win the lotto, right? So it's like just because every lotto winner had to buy a lotto ticket doesn't mean you should advise people to play the lotto. So I'm not saying like, well, yeah, you do need movements to happen, but if you're talking to people and saying, here's just the rundown. Like, these things will impact your life more. There is a small chance that these things might change the world, maybe. But let's not kid ourselves and act like that small chance is anything more than winning the lotto, unless your goals are very narrow.
See, but I'm not willing to tell people that, when you bring up a point about terminal velocity, it's like, okay, but I mean, and you're right. These things don't get changed overnight, but people didn't generally wait. Like, I mean, okay, the fight for equality for African Americans. Um, I mean, some people still feel like we don't have enough equality, but like obviously it's 10 times better in 2021 than it was, back in Dr. King's era, back during the, when the Civil War was happening, right? And so the people who were acting in these times, like, again, there was no guarantee they succeeded, and many of them probably did make minor changes, but those minor changes do build up over time. And on top of that, these people didn't wait for that one moment. That's what I'm trying to get at. Like, you can't wait for that one historical moment when you feel like everything's fallen into place and you can actually make a gigantic splash. You have to, fight for what you think, or you should fight for what you think is right in whatever time you're in, even if you're unlikely to succeed, because
Well, that's how you end up with
that is how
martyrs.
change is made.
Like how many people like we could think of all sorts of transformational figures, but you could if okay, history books aren't written about the not famous people who fail. So it's like, yeah, you can point to, yeah, there had to be a Martin Luther King to get where we are. You're right. There had to be people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King to get here. But it's like, do we know how many people dedicated their whole lives to the same thing Martin Luther King did? And then all that happened was they didn't pursue things that would have made their lives better in other avenues, and they failed. It's like, sure, hypothetically, maybe they inched the movement closer to the direction that Martin Luther King could succeed. But you could also inch the culture in a direction by doing things that aren't dedicating your life if the culture's not there yet, right? So like when I talking about public school teachers, like the dirt on the bottom of my shoe, and I just give a derogatory opinion of all sorts of people who work for the public sector, like that is me advocating a policy position that isn't me cleaning my room. I am spreading that ethos, but I don't need to go to a protest to do it. So there could be all sorts of figures that set the stage, but they don't necessarily have to commit their life to political activism, right? So I wouldn't say, oh well, 100 people were Martin Luther Kings, but they all failed. But at least that set the stage for Martin Luther King, because I'm sure there were hundreds of people who were treated poorly because of their race, and over time, people who were white felt guilty about it because they were dehumanizing humans and treating them poorly. And that's why there's all those stories that people now call like what white savior stories, like The Help. But The Help, I don't know if you know that movie, but it's like a white journalist, trying to help the people who are like servants, more or less, right? Those servants were just being servants, and eventually their cause got pushed forward, but they weren't being transformational figures. I'm not saying like, oh, congrats to them, they were servants, like they did this amazing thing. I'm more just saying like saying things like there had to be 100 Martin Luther Kings to get to Martin Luther King isn't even necessarily true. Like being those figures ahead of your time and failing doesn't even necessarily push the ball forward, for the same reason why anarchists throwing bombs might not push the ball forward. So it's like there are all these calculuses to the point where I'm just like, you can partake in it, but I wouldn't advocate people to do it. Especially in comparison to managing their own life, especially in the world we live in today, where most people aren't like disturbingly tormented beyond getting taxed or getting a nonviolent a nonviolent crime assigned to them, something like that. But beyond that, it's like most people have life good enough to where you can spread ethos and culturally push things in direction, but it doesn't mean you need to dedicate your life to it. That just seems silly. You need to fix your family structure. You need to fix your job. You need to fix the things you can fix for the people you love the most. Obviously, that's more important. And I'll let you get the last word and we'll wrap up. But that's just my take. And I usually I can like I don't know. I'm so not sympathetic to what you're saying that like I feel like I'm being a jerk. But putting it in like any nicer words like feels like I'm lying. So I've had to put it this way. But so for that reason, you get the last word. We'll wrap up. I hope I wasn't too much of an ass, but it happens sometimes.
So I guess the disagreement then can be summed in I would advocate that people get involved in local politics, get involved in whatever party they're most sympathetic to, get involved with just volunteering in their community, or volunteering fighting for some larger movement, larger national movement, or even like a global movement for that matter. Because again, I feel like I'm a broken record, and I don't like to be a broken record, but I'm being a broken record because I think it's important to be a broken record sometimes. To have the sort of worldview of I'm going to clean my room is fine, but you can't stop there. You can't stop with I'm going to clean my room. Sometimes there are sort of, I don't want to use the word moral, but there are bigger questions or bigger problems that can be solved with people actually doing something, actually getting involved in the stream of things. And that's not saying go bomb City Hall. Right? That's not me advocating political violence, but that's me advocating political activism. Because you don't know what your actions are going to lead to ultimately, and you shouldn't go in there thinking I'm going to be the next Dr. King, but you should go in there thinking I'm going to do what I can for the values. I'm going to do what I can to support the values, or support the ideas or support the policies that are most important to me, that I think will make the world a better place. And ultimately, I think you can go to bed more content. And I would definitely be ashamed of myself if I got to my deathbed without ever having done such a thing. At the end of the day, I guess you could say to me, well, this is just your own subjective opinion, Matthew. You can't push it on other people. And I'm not really pushing it on other people, but what I'm saying is, if you have an itch to see the world, if you have an itch to make a difference, if you have an itch to create a world different from this one, then you should scratch that itch. You should follow that instinct.
Well, and on that note, I will note that I do advocate political violence. So even though in Matt's little last wrap up there, he did shy away as a joke. Anybody who commits any political violence for any reason, especially Uncle Ted, who's celebrating his white boy summer in prison, I more than advocate for. So I can't wait till we talk about technological. What is it? Technological slavery? Is that what it's called? When
I
we
was
talk
trying
about
to counteract earlier. I think I did say I was moderately sympathetic to political violence in certain contexts, and then I was like, "Oh no, the FBI agent watching me is gonna report to someone." So I counteracted my first statement with that statement, and now it cancels out, and I can't get in trouble for anything I said. That's how that works, right?
Yeah, I'm always I don't know much on the legality of endorsing it, but I know like in good faith I'm not going to be an actor in it. Like I am too I value my mortality too much and I don't really want to go to prison. So I'm not going to be the guy who spurgs out and shoots up a congressional baseball game like some Bernie Sanders supporters do. But if somebody does choose to do something like that and the victim is public officials in any capacity, then I endorse it. I'm not even going to say it's acceptable. I'm going to say I endorse it. I'm willing to stake out that ground of endorsement. And if that puts me on a watch list, I'm saying here, you have to say that I'm being serious when I endorse it, and I'm serious when I'm saying, hey, in good faith, I'd never do anything. Care too much about being alive and the people in my life. So they'll have to contend with that whole thing being in public domain and recorded and evidence. So I don't think they can really get me.
I only endorse it in certain specific niche scenarios. That's what I'll say.
I do too, and those niche scenarios are anytime it's a public official and public property. Okay, on that note, On that note, you can hear more wonderful Fed posting from me on all our other episodes in the past. You can find those on YouTube or any podcatcher by searching Beyond Talking Points, just like you found this episode. And you can subscribe to all those feeds. You can find more Matt stuff. He does Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse, which is a podcast he's done a handful of episodes on. He also has a YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher, where he's posted vlogs and other things of the sort for all of his commentary that is much more nuanced than me saying public officials deserve to be shot in the head, which is not very nuanced. You can find more of my content that is wonderfully unnuanced and very anti-government on Twitter at Matthew T. Keck. You can find my podcast, The Obey Podcast, where I've done similar rants against the government on all sorts of issues and against the media. Also, you can find other Matt, not me, other Matt, on Twitter at Matthew Hazel WO8. So yeah, it's Matthew Hazelwood, but the OD at the end of Hazelwood is an 8 instead. And even though he did remove the OD at the end of his name, it is not because he is sober and unwilling to do drugs. That was a really funny joke, but very hard to explain, and nobody is going to get that. That probably wasn't well delivered. But on that note, sign off for now is Matt and Matt. Thank you.